Hi and welcome to this YouTube video. In this video, I will teach you how to authenticate your APIs using token authentication or Django REST. So the first thing that we need to do is obviously set up a project. And if you don't have a project yet, you can just go ahead and set it up. You know the step. So we need to create a project's directory first. I created one earlier and I called it API authentication. So you can call it whatever. Then the next step we need to take is open our command line and cd into where this folder is. I'm going to say cd API authentication. Now the next step that we need to take is we need to create a virtual environment. Now the way I create my virtual environment is I use a library called pipenv shell. And if you want to get this library, I run pip install pip env. Now, if you have a special way of creating your virtual environment and make use of it, me, I like using pip install pip env. I like using the pip env command library. So after you've gotten that library, the next step we need to do is now create this virtual environment. So run the command pip env shell, pip env shell to create this virtual environment. Now, once you run that command, you'll see that it will create a virtual environment and automatically activate this virtual environment for you. And if you would like to exit the virtual environment, just type exit and it exits out of the virtual environment. If you would like to reactivate it, you type pip env shell once more and it just simply reactivates that virtual environment. So after creating a virtual environment, we need to install the libraries that we need, being Django and Django REST framework. I'm just going to run pip install Django REST framework. So this will quickly install Django and Django REST framework for us. Okay, so that has installed. The next step that we need to take is we need to create a Django project. So you just do that by saying Django-admin start project. Now, what are we going to call this project? We're going to call it Auth API. Now, you can name this project whatever you want. I have chosen to call mine Auth API. So after doing that, just cd into Auth API. Cd Auth API. Then the next step we need to take is create an application. I'll do that by saying python manage.py start app. And I'm going to call this app API Auth. I'm sorry that it seems like I'm running through the installation, but at this stage, I think you should already have some knowledge on how to set up Django project. So that is why I'm running through. So when I say ls right now, we can see that the app folder and the project folder has been created. Now the next step we need to take is open our projects folder in our code editor. I use Visual Studio Code, so I will proceed to open this folder in Visual Studio. I'm just going to yes. So open the folder. Now the next step is we need to register our app in settings.py file of our project. So come over to installed apps and then just type in auth or API auth app. API auth app. Now after doing that, we also need to register Django REST framework because we had already installed it. So we need to register it in installed apps. So say REST framework, REST underscore framework. And after doing that, we also need to register auth tokens from REST framework because we're going to be authenticating this API. We're going to be authenticating API requests using token authentication. So just type REST underscore framework dot auth token. So after doing that, just save the settings.py file and move on. Now, the next step that we need to take is we need to create a urls.py file inside our app folder so that we can create routes for our endpoint inside the app. So just create the urls.py file. And inside the file, I'm going to just say from, let's zoom in a bit. I will say from django.urls import path. And then next, I'm going to say from dot import views. That is from this current working directory, import the views.py file. And after doing that, we'll just create an empty URL patterns list. And this will be filled later on, but for now, we're going to leave it. So after doing that, we then need to register. We need to tell our URLs file in the projects folder that we have a separate URLs file inside the app. So at the top right here, okay, at the top right here online, after path, just type. So we want to import include from django.url. And what we now simply want to tell Django is that I want you to go into the app folder and take note of the URLs file and all the routes inside that file. I'm going to say include, and in quotes, I'll type in the name of my app, which is API auth app.urls. So let's save that. Then after creating URLs, after registering the urls.py file, next step we just need to take is run our server. Let me clear up my screen. I'm going to say python manage py run server. Okay, it says rest framework. I got the spelling wrong. So I'm going to go to my settings and I make sure I spell that correctly. Rest underscore framework. Okay. Now we can see that the server is running perfectly. So we also have to run migrations and migrate to get rid of this error. So break out of the terminal and run python manage.py, make migration, and then python manage.py great. So this will just take all those changes and save them in the database. So we now need to run our server. I'm just going to go ahead and run my server. I'll copy the link that has been given to me, go to my browser and put it. So you can see that we have successfully set up the Django project. So that is what we're just basically doing in this section, setting up the project. Now the next step that we're going to take is creating the 3 endpoints that we're going to be making use of this video. The first endpoint is the signup endpoint. Second one is the login endpoint. And the third endpoint, the endpoints that we're going to use to test if our authentication actually works. That is, users will only be able to make successful requests to that endpoint if they are authenticated. Now, there's actually one extra endpoint that I didn't mention, which is the logout endpoint. I will also teach you how to allow users or clients log out of API. So right now, what we need to do is head to our views.py file inside the application folder. Now we need to import a few libraries and modules. So the first one that we need to import is API view. So let's just say from Django dot from REST framework. Okay, I need to select the right virtual environment. So I'm going to say from REST framework dot decorators import API view. Now the next thing that we need to import is the Django user model, because of course we're working with user authentication. So say from Django dot contrib dot auth dot models import user. Now the last library that we need to import for now is called response. So just type from REST framework dot response import response. Okay, So now we've imported the libraries that we need. The next step that we now need to take is create the four endpoints, or the four view functions that we need to create our four endpoints. So the first one is the sign up endpoint. I'm just going to say define or def sign up, signu, and in here I'll pass a request. And for now, I'll just return a response. Very S. For now, I'll return a response of message, and the message is sign up page. Now I'll copy this and just paste for rest of view functions or the endpoints that we need to create. So this is going to be for the login. The login page. And I'll also do the same for test view. Now call this test view page. And the last is the logout page. This is going to be the logout. The message is going to be logout page. Right. So now we have created these four view functions. The next thing we now need to do is now create URL endpoints that we're going to map to this function. So go to your urls.py file inside your application folder. Now we need to create URL endpoints for login. I'm going to say path, and login is going to be at / or login. It's going to be / login. And then we need to just say views dot login, because we need to first declare the actual path. Then we need to pass in a view function that we're trying to map to. So after doing that, we're going to create one for sign up. It's going to be / sign up. And then we're going to say views dot sign up. We also need to create for the test logout view. I'm going to call this test view, test as view. And this is going to be mapped to the test view function. And the last one, which is logout, is going to be mapped to logout view function. Okay, so we have created this endpoint successfully. The next step that we need to take is to actually test if these endpoints are working properly. So what I like using to test my APIs, Postman. Postman is a software that you can use to test and basically build API. So if you would like to get Postman, I'm going to leave a link in the description below that is going to take you to a page where you can download Postman. Now, once you download it, we can proceed with the video. Or if you have other ways of testing your APIs, you can go ahead and use those other ways or other softwares. So let's head back to Visual Studio Code. The next step that we now need to take is open Postman. Now, once you open Postman, I think you might need to log in or create an account. But once you are ready and set up, you can come over here and create a new tab. So after creating that new tab, there is something else that we need to specify on these view functions that we had created. If you remember, we imported a library at the top called API view. Now, what this API view does is that once declared over any view function, it dictates what kind of request can be made to that endpoint. So for example, since at the sign up view, we want users to be able to sign up, that is, they're sending data, which is their username, password, and other details to this endpoint. What we need to declare is that we want these endpoints to only accept a post request. So to do this, I'm going to say at API view. After doing that, open parentheses, and in a list, just passing, we're just going to pass in a number of request types that this, or request methods that these endpoints can take. I'm going to pass in posts since we only want this endpoint to accept a post request. Now I'm going to copy it and do the same for the login. And I will also do the same for the logout view. Now for the test view, this is going to be get request and not a post request. But when we get to building more code for this view, we're going to see why we want this get request. So right now we have created 4 views and we have created URL endpoints for this view. Let's now test this sign up view, see if it works. So I'm going to come over to the terminal and copy the base URL that has been given to me by the terminal. Then go to Postman. Now in here, we just need to paste the URL that's been copied. And since we want to test the sign up view endpoint, and we know that it's /sign up that we assign to it, I'm just going to copy that and paste it there and put a /. Then we need to change the kind of request that we are sending to be a post request. Now, once we send this request, you can see that a message was returned to us saying message sign up page, and that is what was returned here. So now we can validate that our endpoints are working perfectly. And if you try to change this to like a get request and send it, you can see it shows an error saying detail method get not allowed. So we know that our endpoint only accepts the specific request that we have declared. So now that we have tested this endpoint, see it works. The next thing that we need to do is we need to work on the sign up endpoint. So to proceed with the sign up view, the next step that we need to take is we need to create a file called serializers.py. Now, I am going to explain what serializers are shortly, but just follow the steps that I'm. So create a file in your app folder called serializers.py. That's Serializia. Serializers.py. RIAL. So once we create the file, we need to import a few libraries. The first one that we need to import is the Django user module. So I'm going to say from Django contrib.auth models import user. Now, after importing that, we also need to import a different library or class. So we need to say from REST framework .serializers import model serializer. So after importing those two libraries, the next thing that we need to do is now create a serializer class. Now, what exactly is a serializer? A serializer basically helps us map JSON objects from our API entries into our database. So, for example, let's say a user sends a post request from from the client. So for example, let's say the user or the client sends a post request to our API. Our API can't just take that request and save the data into the database just like that. It needs to be converted into a format that is suitable enough to be saved in a database. And it works vice versa. If a client was requesting data from our API, that is, if a client wanted to retrieve data from our database via our API, what our API will need to do is first query the database for that data, then pass it through a serializer to convert the complex data type to something which the response class can return back to the client. So typically, we know that the way the Django ORM works, anytime you query data, it's returned back to you, it's returned back to the program in form of objects. Now that object is too complex a data type for the response class right here, for the response class to just send like that. What we need to do is pass that query set or the objects that have been returned from the query through serializers. The serializer then converts it into a suitable format, typically JSON format, usually JSON format, and then it is sent back to the client. So that was a long explanation. What we need to do right now is create a user serializer class. So let's say class, and we'll call it user serializer class. And then what we simply need to do is, or we can just call it user serializer instead of user serializer. Then inside parentheses, we're going to pass in model serializer because we want this class to inherit from model serializer class. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a class meta. After doing this, we need to specify what model we are trying to serialize. Since we are working with the user model, I am going to set the model to be equal to Django user model, since that is what we are working with. Then we also need to specify the fields. That is what kind of fields we would like to serialize. So since we are only going to be talking about like the basic fields in this video, like ID, username, password, and email, that is what we are going to pass into. I'm going to pass in ID, my username, email, and password. So after creating this serializer class, all we have to do is just save it, and we are good to go for now. As our class. Now we need to import the serializer we just created into our views file. So we're going to say from .serializers import user serializer, that is serializer that we had just created. We also need to import a few other libraries. We need to say from REST framework import status, because every time we are returning a response back to clients, we always want to return status code also. So the next library that we need to import is the token library, or the token yes library, because we are going to be generating tokens which the client is going to use to authenticate itself. Since we are working with token authentication, we are going to say from REST framework dot auth token dot models import token. So after importing these libraries, we now need to come down to signup view. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a serializer instance right here. So I'm going to say serializer equals to user serializer, which is the serializer that we had created serializers.py file. And in here, we need to pass in data equals request. So what exactly are we doing here? We know that the client is going to send a post request, and that post request is going to contain the required items to create an account, which are the username, email, and password. So when we say data equals request.data, we are trying to grab that data and pass it into our user serializer class. Now in our user serializer class, we are then going to write save method, which is going to take all that data and create a new user. And after creating that user, it's going to generate a token and return that token back to the user. So the next step that we need to take is that we now need to check if the serializer is valid. That is, if the client sent us valid data. Another wonderful thing about serializers, right off the bat, it can do validation for. So for example, if the client didn't send a username, email, or password, it's going to throw an error saying username field was not specified, or the password field was not specified. And it also does extra validation. For example, it can check if a user already exists, and if it does, it throws an error. So what we simply need to check if what we simply need to do to check if the data that the client has sent is valid is that we just need to say if serializer dot is valid. If serializer dot is valid, this what we now need to simply say if the serializer is valid, we now need to save this serializer. So I'm going to say serializer.save. Now, in Django, the serializers that we create usually have a default save method, but we're going to create our own save method and override the default save method. Now, we are doing this because immediately we're creating a user. What we want to do is we want to generate a token and return it back to that user, or return it back to the client so that the clients can be authenticated using a generated token. So as a user is signing up, or as a client is sending a post request to our sign up endpoint, what is happening is that their account is going to be created, and a token is going to be created and sent to them. So let's save this and head back to our serializers.py file. Now we need to create the save method. So just come down, create a function. I'm going to call this def save, and then we need to pass in two things in here. We need to pass in self and keyword args, keyword argument. Now after creating this save method, what we now need to do right now is inside this save method, we are going to write some code that is going to create this user, that is going to create a new user based on the data that the client had. So in here, I'm just going to create a new variable and I'll call it new user. Now equate it to the user class. And I'll say user.object.create user. Now in here, we're just going to pass in the details that the client had sent in that the client had sent, and we're going to pass it into this serializer, and we're going to grab those details in here and pass it to just create user class so that we can create a new user using those details. So what we are going to say here is we need to first specify the username. And I'm going to equate it to self.validated data, and in here I'll pass in username. Now what we are doing here is that, remember I told you that the serializer automatically validates whatever we pass into here. Check if the data that was passed in is the price data. So what we now simply need to do is that if the data is valid, we want to grab that validated data where the username, we want to grab the validated data where the key is username. So what we can now simply do is anytime the client sends a post request and it has a key value of username, if the data is valid, this save method is going to search for a key value, a key that has a username, and is going to assign the value to the username. I hope you understand what I meant. It's just simply going into the data that user had sent, and then it is grabbing the username key. So after doing that, we need to do the exact same thing for email. I'm going to say email equals to self.validated data. I'm going to pass in email here, and I will do the exact same thing for password. I will equate it to self.validated data password. Now the next step that we need to take is we just need to save this. I'm going to say new user, save. Now after creating this user, remember that I said we are going to need to create a new token for this. So just go over to your views and copy this input right here and paste it in Serializers. What we need to do is create a new token for this user after the user's account has been created. So I'm just going to come down and I will create a new variable and call it new token. Now equals that to token. I'll say token.objects.create. Token.objects.create. And inside the parentheses, what we simply need to do is we need to pass in what user we're trying to create this token for. I'm going to say user equals to this new user that we are creating at the top. I'm going to say user is equals to new user. So we have successfully written all the code that we need to write for save method. Again, the save method, it creates a new user and then it grabs all this data from the validated data of what the client sent. And after grabbing all these fields and assigning them, it saves this new user and generates a new token. Let's head back to our views.py file because we need to write more code. Now, what we simply need to do here is that after this serializer has been saved, that is at this point, the account has been created and a token has been created. What we now need to do is we need to return a proper response. And in this response that we're returning back to the client, we're going to return the user object and we're also going to return the token that was generated for so that the user can be authenticated. So what we now need to say here is after serializer.save, we need to come down and we need to get this user object that was just created. I'm going to say user is equals to user.object.get, and I will say username is equals to request.data username. Now I will explain exactly what I am doing, but just work with me. So after getting that user object, I also want to get the token, and I'll say token is equals to token.objects.get, and I will pass in user equals to. So what essentially am I doing here? So earlier we would have already created that user object and generated a token for that user that was just created. Now what we now want to do is we want to get that particular user object that was created, and we also want to get a token that is assigned to that particular user that was just generated. Now the reason why we need to make these queries is because we want to return as a response this user that was just created and the token that was also created, this user. So after doing that, what we simply need to say is we need to pass this user through this serializer class. If you remember, I said that we can't just return a query set like this through the response class. If we try to do something like return response, and I pass in user, this would give an error because the response class can't just outrightly send a query set. It needs to be converted to a more suitable format that it can handle. So having that in mind, what we just simply need to do is we need to pass this user query set through our user serializer class. So I'm going to come down here and say serializer equals to user serializer, and in here I'll just pass in user. So what I am now going to say is instead of returning the user, I'm going to return serializer.data. Now that is going to help us convert this user object to a more suitable format, which is usually JSON. In the response format can then send to convert it into a table format, and then the response class will send the data back to the client, usually in JSON form. Now remember that we also want to send this token as a response also. So we can come down here and create a dictionary, and in here I'm just going to call it data. Now equate this to a dictionary, and in this dictionary I will say the user is going to be equated to serializer.data, and I also want to pass in the token which was just created, and now paste that to token. Now instead of returning just the serializer, we want to return the serializer and token. So I'll just say return data. And after returning this data, we also want to return a status code, uh, telling the user or telling the clients that the data was created, the account was created successfully. So we're going to use a 201 HTTP status code, which is usually returned when resource was created successfully in the database. So I'm going to say return data, and then after that, I'll put a comma and I'll say status equals to status dot HTTP response HTTP 201 create. Now let's save that. Now we have successfully written out code for the sign up view that takes in data that the user types in from client or whatever is making this request to our. And then our API is capable of checking if the serializer is valid. And if it is valid, it's if the data rather is valid. And if it is valid, it creates this new account and it creates a token for that account. And it returns the user and the token back to the client so that the client can be authenticated using token. Now, what if the user serializer isn't valid? We need to return a response telling the user that telling the client rather that an error was encountered. So what we're simply going to say is else, or we don't need to type an else. We can just return the error like that. We can say return response, and we're going to say serializer dot errors. So what this does is if the serializer wasn't valid, then we're just going to return whatever errors that the serializer generates automatically for us. And after doing that, we're going to pass a status of status.http 400 bad request. We are telling the clients that it sent a bad request if the data isn't valid. So we can go ahead and remove this ones below. So what we need to do right now is we just need to test to see if this endpoint works perfectly. But in order to actually test, we need to first create a super user so that we can view all our data in the admin dashboard. Head over to your terminal and run the command python manage.py create super user. Now I'm just going to type in a username of admin, an email address of test@gmail.com, password of I'm just going to type that that and then it says super user created successfully. So what we need to do right now is we need to head over to admin dashboard. So I'm going to go to /admin, but we have to make sure the server is running. I'm going to run python manage.py run server, and I'm going to reload the page. So just log in with the details you had used to create super user. So right now we can see that there is just one user in dashboard, which is the one we created using super user. So what we need to do right now is we need to test our API, see if it is actually working. So head over to Postman, and for this sign up endpoint right here, what we need to do is we need to specify some parameters that we want to send in the post request, because from this post request in the data, our serializer is expecting that we send username, email, and password. We don't need to care about ID because ID is usually our and it is automatically generated each database entry. But it's expecting that we send username, email, and password. So let's head over to post or whatever API testing tool here. And we want to head over to body. And under body, we want to select form data. Let me it. So after selecting form data, we need to start specifying the keys and values. So the first key is username. And for username, I'm just going to pass in a value of John or test user. Let's say test user. And the next field is email. So for email, I'm just going to specify, I'm just going to say testing@gmail.com. And for password, I'm going to give a password of testing 321. So again, if we go to the admin dashboard, we can see that there's only one user, a username of admin, email of test@gmail.com. So when we go back to what we can do right now is first change this from a get request to a post request. And then we have specified all the keys: username, email, password, and test user at Gmail. So what we now need to do is send this. Now we are getting an error, and the error says object of type token is not JSON serializable. Okay, so we need to head back to our code as it seems we are getting error. So the reason why we were getting this error is because I tried to return this object as right here, but I can't do that. And what we actually just really need is the key from this token. So instead of passing in the entire object, what we can just simply say is token.key. So by saying dot key, we are going into this particular database entry, and then we are grabbing the field. If we view this model for the token, we can see that we have a field called key. Now it is in this field that the actual key is stored. So what we just need to do is save our views.py file, make sure our server is running, and then head back to. Once we are back as Postman, we can just resend this request, and then it says a user with that username already. Okay, let's try to create a different user. So let's try to create a user with a username of for example, John. Now once we send this request, you can see that our code works perfectly well. It's returned a user. It's returned a user object of ID3, username John, and testing@gmail.com. And then you can see it also returned a token back to us. Now, if we go to the admin dashboard, check to see if that user was actually created. Once we refresh, we can see that John was created in database. And if we go to tokens, you can see that a token was created for John. So our code is working perfectly. Now I'm sure you are confused. You might be confused as to how test user got created. Remember that the error we got came from this particular part. Now we're trying to retrieve the key, and what we were doing was turning the entire object. So before execution of code got to detection, user had been created already for serializers, and the token had been created. So what we can just simply do is delete this test user account, and you can see it is gone. So right now our API worked perfectly. It's created that user for us, and it's created a token, turned back that data. Now if we try to send this request again, you can see an error is generated. A user with that username already exists. Now that error is coming from this section of code that we wrote here. So if the serializer isn't valid after it has done all the validations, and part of that validation is to make sure that unique fields in database like usernames are not repeated. So since we were trying to create a user with a username John that already exists, it came here to check if the data was valid, and since it wasn't valid, it found an error response here. And here we can see that we told Django to return a 400 bad request. To come back to post, we can see that it's 400 bad request that is being. Right now, our our sign up endpoint works perfectly. We can try to create a different user with a username of example let's say Mary or Matty. And once we send this, you can see the user was created and the details were returned back to us, user and the token. And if we come to admin dashboard and refresh, notice that the user called Matty has created. So right now, the sign up view works very well. The next view that we need to work on, login view. So the next thing, step that we need to take is we need to import a particular library. So just type with me, say from django.contrib.auth import authenticate. So we're going to be using this library to authenticate users in the login view. So right here in the login view, what we first need to do is we need to get the incoming data that the user is or the client is going to send the post request. So just say data is equals to request dot data. So right now we are assigning all the data that the user has typed in their username and password, assigning it to variable. So the next step that we need to take is we now need to authenticate the user to check if to check if any user with that username and password actually exists in the database. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to create a new variable and I'll call it authenticate user, and I'll equate that to the authenticate library we just input. And in here we need to pass in username is equals to data, and in quotes we'll pass in username, and after doing that we'll put a comma and say password equals to data password. What exactly are we doing here? We are trying to authenticate the user to check if a user with the username and password which the client in database. Now remember here we grab the data that's typed in or the client types in and sends to our API. We are grabbing it here by saying data, and we're using the username key. Grab whatever the or to grab whatever the client sent as a username. We're doing the exact same thing. So after doing this, the authenticate class either returns a user object or it returns none. That is, if a user with these login details exists, it returns the user object. Or if it doesn't exist, it returns none. So what we simply need to see here is authenticate if authenticate user is not none. That is, if a user with this login detail actually exists in a database. So what we now need to do is we need to return this user object back to the client, and we also need to get the token, the login token for this, and return it back to the client. So first, I want to get user object. I'm going to say user is equals to request dot actually no user is equals to user dot object dot get, and for the username I'm going to pass in data, and in square brackets I'm going to pass in username. So we just want to grab a user object where the username is what the client entered in the post request that was. So after getting the user object, what we now need to do again is we need to pass it through the UserSerializer class that we had created, so that the response class has a proper data type, data format that can return back. But what we just simply need to do is type serializer. Yes, serializer is equals to user serializer, and in here we are just going to pass in user. So this is going to help us serialize this user object. So after doing that, the next thing that we need to get and return back to the client is the token the token that is going to help the user stay authenticated. So what we need to do is say get token, comma, created token. Now I am going to explain exactly why we are doing this. I'm going to say get token, comma, created token equals to token dot object dot get or create. And in here, all I'm simply going to say is user equals to user. So why exactly are we saying this? So let's say, for instance, user logs out of our. Obviously, since the user is logging out of website or the web app or whatever token that was created to authenticate the user during that period as user was logged in is going to be deleted. So for every time our user logs out, whatever token that the client or the user was using to stay authenticated is going to be deleted. So upon login, what we want to do, we want to check if a token exists. And if a token does not exist, what we need to do is we need to create a new one. So that is why we're saying token.objects.get or create. That is why we're saying get token, comma, created token. Actually, I think I'm going to name this variable. I'm going to name token, and I will rename this. I'm going to leave it as created token. So right here, when we say token, comma, created token, what we're simply saying is that if this token object actually exists in the database, we want to equate it to the token variable. But if token doesn't exist, obviously we're going to create that token, and we want to equate that created token to this variable called created token. So basically, this helps us return a token to the client whether or not one exists in the database. So immediately after doing this, the next step we need to take is we need to return this user. We need to return this user token back to the client. So what I am simply going to do is I'm going to create a dictionary here, and I'm going to say I'm going to call it response data, or say response underscore data equals to this. And for the user serializer or the user data that we want to send, I will equate this to be called. Now equate that to serializer dot data, because the serializer is trying to convert the user query sets we have here. And after doing that, we need to return token also. So I'm going to come down here and say if token, that is, if a token already exists in the database, then we want to save this particular token to the response data dictionary. I'm going to say response data, and I want to give the token a key of token, and I'll request that to token. But if the token, if no token existed in database and a new one was created, we need to save that as a token in response data dictionary. I'm going to say else. Instead of saying else, I'll say else if created token. And now just copy this line, paste it, and instead of equating it to token, I'll equate it to created token. Now, after getting all the data that we need to return to the client, we're just going to simply say return response, and in here I'm just going to return response data. So that should be all the code we need to write. Let's let this up. That should be all the code we need to write. For we also need to write some extra code to make sure that if the user is if the client entered the wrong detail, that is, if this authenticate class would not authenticate this with the user detail, we need to return an error telling the client that wrong details were entered. So I'm just going to in here I'm just going to type return response, And I'm going to say, create a small dictionary here. I'll say detail. And the error message is going to be not found. That is, if the user enters details, login details of the user that does not exist, an error message of detail not found is going to be returned back to. And the status code that we want to return is status dot for wait dot http. So I am going to say status is equals to status dot http, and then we want to send a 400 bad request. So if the client or the user sends a username and password that could not be authenticated, meaning that the details are wrong, you're going to send a response showing details not found, and you're going to send a 400 bad status request along with this message. So all we have to do right now is save and come over to test our API end. So I'm just going to copy this URL, create a new tab, paste the link. And instead of sign up, I'll put forward slash. Now, please make sure you put a forward slash, a trailing forward slash, get an error. So what we need to specify right now are the username, password field. So let's just say we want to log into um John or the Mati account. Let's just refresh. Let's say we want to log into the Mati account. We can test that right now. Postman. So we're going to enter a username Mati and a password of testing32, because that was what we specified here. Password testing3. So if we once we hit send, specify a post. Once we hit send, able to this request. Okay, receive the response. We're getting errors here. Sent is wrong part. Let's go to body form data. Sorry, I sent it from. So we go to body form data. So we need to send the username, which is Marty, and a password testing. Let me just clear out, make sure mess with. So let's just send this request right now. So we're getting an error from this. It says object of type token. Okay, I made the same mistake again. Instead of just saying token, passing token does, and right here created token. Okay. Now that should be solved. Let's send this request. And what do we have? We have that the user object has been returned back to us, and the token has been returned back to us. So we can see that our code is working perfectly well. We hit the login endpoint, and the user object as well as the token was returned back to us. So anybody that is using our API right now can sign up, login, and immediately they sign up or login, the token is going to be generated, returned back to clients. So we have written code for this login, and everything is working perfectly. The next step is we need to write code for test endpoint. Now, this test endpoint is where we are now actually going to see if all the code we have written is actually functional. So if any user wants to make a request to this, they will need to be authenticated. And in order to prove that they're authenticated, the client rather would have to send that token back this endpoint when it wants to make a request. Again, if a client or an external service wants to make a request to endpoints, which is test view, they will need to provide a token so that they can be authenticated. And it's that token that is returned to the client when try to log in or sign up. So in order to do that, what we are going to need to do first is we are going to need to import a whole bunch of libraries. So the first one that we're going to need to import permission class. So just say from REST framework decorators import authentication class and permission. From REST framework decorators import authentication classes, permission class. Now the next thing that we need to import is token authentication session. We're going to say from REST framework authentication import token authentication session. Now the last thing that we need to import is library. So we're going to say from REST framework permission import. So we are going to see how exactly these libraries that we imported are going to work hand in hand to make sure that a user or a client must be created before they can hit any particular view. So right now we see that this API view, which is test view, only accepts a get request. So what we now need to do is we need to specify more things under this test view. So the first thing that we need to specify are the authentication classes as this test view takes. So I'm just going to say at authentication classes, now create parenthesis. And inside the parenthesis, I'll create list. Now inside this list, we're going to pass in session authentication and token authentication. So what we're simply saying is that we want to authenticate this test view. We want to authenticate the sessions of this test view using token authentication. We're just specifying that in order for any client to make a request to this view, this test view, they must provide a token first before they are granted access to this. Then the last thing that we need to specify right now is permission classes. We're going to say at permission classes, do the same thing, raise the parenthesis, raise the list. And inside here, we'll just pass in is. So what this line does is that we're just telling Django that in order to access this, the client must be authenticated and they must be authenticated using token authentication. So that is what this import really mean. Sorry, let me just okay. So after specifying all of this at the top, the next thing that we need to do is we now need to specify we need to test this endpoint, see if it. So if I copy URL, this endpoint is called test view. Let's head back to post. I'll create a new tab. I'll copy. So once I change this to test dash view, I said test dash view, test dash view, that's the URL end. If I try to access this endpoint, it says detail authentication credentials were not provided. So what does this tell us? It tells us that anytime a user tries to make a request to this endpoint, they must provide a token in order for them to be able to access this endpoint. That is why we got this error saying detail authentication credentials were not provided. So then the question comes up of, okay, how do we now access this endpoint? So it's very easy. All we have to do first of all, send a request in the login endpoint. and make sure we get our token. Now, once we get that token, what we simply need to do is that we need to pass that token into a particular place. So in order to fully test the endpoints, we'll go to authorization. And under authorization, this is for if you are using Post. But if you aren't using Postman, you have to paste this in the headers. So under type, we're going to select OAuth 2.0, and we're just going to paste the token here. So if this is the first time you are using Post, this might probably say something like Gera. I want you to change this to token. Make sure token is written this field. So once you've pasted your token and you make sure that token is written here, all we simply have to do is send this. And once we send this request, what do you have? Message, test view page. You can see that we have been authenticated and we were able to request that, and we're able to see the response that this sends. So we can just add like gibberish to really show you that we have been authenticated. And if I hit this endpoint again, you can see that authenticated using token. So right now, we have successfully created 3 endpoints. First endpoint for signing up, second for logging in, and the third endpoint to actually test and make sure that our authentication method is working. And this these decorators at the top just make sure that the authentication, proper authentication methods in and so the last view that we need to work on, log out view. So obviously we would want our clients to be able to log out of our API. So when a client or a user logs out of our, what we want is that we want um current token that they are using, right, just to be dead, so that when next they are trying to log in, they can have a new token generated. And just for security reasons, if a single token is if a single token isn't changed, and if it's that token that is constantly being used, it's definitely not safe. Anybody grabs hold of the token, then they can log into whatever account it is. So we need to make sure that anytime a user logs out, the token is destroyed, and when they are trying to log in, a new one is created for them, which is what we had done here. So in order to do this, we need to import a few libraries, or just one. So from django.contrib.auth, import authenticate, and we need to import logout. So after doing that, what we need to do right now is we need to specify some of the same authentication classes. I'm going to copy now, paste it. Obviously, in order for somebody to, in order for a client to be able to log out, they need to be sending a post request. Actually, we need to change this to get request. In order for a client to be able to log out, it needs to be a get request, and they need to be authenticated. Because obviously, if you are not authenticated, then you need to log. So, once these decorators are at the top, right, what we simply need to say is request request.user dot auth request.user dot auth token. So what we're saying here is request.use auth underscore. It's just going to get the authentication token that has been generated for this. It's going to delete it. Then after deleting it, we just want to log out request, passing request. And after doing that, we just want to return a message saying log out successful. So let's say, for example, we want to log out of the Mati account. Remember that we had logged into the Mati account right here using his username, password. And what if you want to log out of that account? All we simply need to do is provide the um, token and we will be logged out. So let's test this endpoint to see if it works. If we look at serial at the URLs.py, we can see that the logout URL, sorry, you can see that the logout endpoint is forward slash. So what we have to do is go to Postman. We're going to copy the entire URL and create a new tab. Now paste it. Make sure it's a get request. Now after specifying that it gets request, what we simply need to do again is go to authorization and select 0.0, and then we need to copy this token generated that was generated when we logged, and we need to paste it. So once we send this request, this invalid token copied, they didn't copy the request then. Let's copy that. So you can see that it even does all this validation for us. And if you enter a wrong token, it says invalid token. So what we simply need to do right now is just paste it right. And once I hit send, you can see that is oh I sent this to forward slash log out. So all we simply need to do right now is send this, and we are getting an error. Says the request argument must be an int, not to rest from. Okay, let's before we test endpoint, I think, yeah, before we test the endpoint, we need to remove this 70 as it is not needed. We can remove that line and can move the import, because I just realized that it's not needed. So all we have to do is just this um save this view, and then we need to take note of the URL endpoints that we specify for that, and we know it's forward slash logout. So what we can now do is go to Postman, and then we can create a new tab, and I'm just going to make sure that URL endpoints that I want to hit called forward slash logout. So we need to also specify that it gets request. Since a user has to be authenticated before they can, means we also need to send a token. So I am going to go to the login tab and hit send so that a new token can be generated. I'll copy that token, come over to logout, hit authorization, I'll click type and hit, and I am going to paste the token right here. And once I send this request, you can see that a message was sent to us saying logout was successful. And when we come back and check the admin dashboard, once we refresh, we can see that the token for Mati isn't present anymore. If we try to generate a token right now, we try to generate a token or try to log in for Mati, right? And I refresh the admin dashboard, you can see a new token has been generated, Mati. But as soon as I go to the logout tab and I change the token to the new one that was generated and hit send, we are getting a message that logout was successful. So when I come back to the admin dashboard and refresh, you can see that that token has been. So we have successfully built an authentication system for our Django REST framework API. And you can basically plug this into any project you're using, if you want to use token authentication. So that is all for today, guys. If you have any question regarding this, please leave a comment in the comment section. Reply you, and please do not forget that you can get all the code to this project in on my GitHub using a link in description below. Thank you for watching this video.